This episode of New Politics was released on the 22nd of June, 2024, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Welcome to New Politics. In this episode, Peter Dutton has gone fully nuclear, but will there be a political cost to pay? Has Anthony Albanese's appeasement of News Corporation helped or hindered him? Australia greets a Chinese premier with a bit of old-fashioned racism, and a pay rise for politicians. I'm Eddie Djokovic, editor of New Politics.
I'm David Lewis, one of Australia's least wanted.
And we do have a few listeners in Sicily this week, and arrivederla to all of our good friends in Palermo. One day we might actually do an episode in Italian, you never know, but it doesn't really matter which part of the world you're in. If you'd like to support New Politics, you can always support us through Patreon or Substack, or you can go to our website at newpolitics.com.au and purchase one of our books. And all of this, of course, is a good way to support independent journalism. The climate wars are continuing, and it's been running for longer than the 100 Years' War, I think. And the coalition ramped this up to volume 11 this week by announcing 7 locations to build their proposed nuclear power stations. And as we've suggested many times before, David, these are never actually going to be built, but they do offer a chance for Peter Dutton to hog the political agenda and make it look like he's doing something on climate change when he's actually not. And there are quite a few issues here. Nuclear power would be expensive to set up in Australia, especially in the context of far cheaper options with renewable energy. And that's also considering setup costs and maintenance costs. So supply from nuclear energy is always going to be very expensive and lead to higher energy prices. And the other indication that they're not really serious about all of this is that of the 7 proposed sites, 6 are in very safe Liberal and National Party held seats. So they know that nobody wants these nuclear power stations in their backyard. So that's why they're going for these very, very safe seats. And that partially removes the not in my backyard syndrome. But it's also an opportunity to spread disinformation and lies. And in his announcement, Peter Dutton said that there are no countries in the world that have got a 24/7 energy source from renewable energy. That's not true. There are currently 8 countries with 100% renewable energy supply, 20 countries with over 90%, and 30 countries with over 80% renewable energy supply. So what he actually said was completely incorrect. And there's many other countries, including Germany and UK, which are now aiming for 100% renewable energy by 2035. And he also said that the creation of nuclear energy is at a fraction of the cost of renewable energy. Again, that's not true. He said that the cost of renewable transition is $1.5 trillion, and that's twice the amount of the annual federal government budget. No one knows where this ridiculous figure has come from, and no one in the media has actually asked where it came from either. And the other big issue is that he's not actually announcing what any of this will cost, and deliberately so. Here's one exchange between Andrew Clarnell from Sky News and Peter Dutton.
This is the biggest announcement I can remember for a federal opposition. Why can't you come to us with a cost on this? Do you believe the CSIRO's $8 billion cost?
We'll deal with the cost in the next stage of our policy announcements, but today I want the very clear focus to be on the fact that the sites we're proposing are end-of-use coal-fired power station sites.
Are you talking about 7 nuclear power plants or the opportunity for 7 nuclear power plants?
No, we're talking about seven nuclear power plants. We've identified those sites. We want to utilise the end-of-life coal-fired power station sites because the poles and wires already exist. I'm very happy for the election to be a referendum on energy, on nuclear, on power prices, on lights going out, on who has a sustainable pathway for our country going forward.
And here's what the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, had to say about this.
Seriously, what a joke. They're out there talking about a half-baked plan. There are no costs. The reason why there are no costings out there is because it is so expensive, because it doesn't add up. That's why they're trying to hide it. Just as Peter Dutton has said, we'll tell you what we're going to do on 2030 after the election. And I'll make this tip. There's a reason why people hide costings, and that's because those costings would completely rule out any rational person going down this nuclear road.
Peter Dutton is asking the Australian public to trust him on a lot of these issues, but this is the party that couldn't build the Snowy Mountains 2.0 scheme, and there's still a lot of problems with that. They couldn't build the national broadband network properly. That's a second-rate and slow broadband system when compared to international standards. And they couldn't even build those car parks under the infrastructure rorts scheme. So now they're expecting the electorate to trust them on nuclear power stations. I just think that this is a pretty big ask.
One of the things that must become obvious to even some of the right who choose to see it is that without media support, the current Liberal Party would be nowhere. If we had consistently quality media, these ideas wouldn't get a run. They're stupid. He has refused until recently to give any costing details. What little we know shows that the costing is optimistic at best, wildly and ludicrously inaccurate at worst. I will say that it can be built at a fraction of the cost because 10 over 2 is a fraction. And okay, yeah, we can reduce that to 5 over 1, but you get my point. For a party that should be thinking about safer options, how do we get back into power? How do we get back into government? I know, let's take something that's unpopular, that the electorate is leery of, that has no real political gain. Will take a minimum of 13 years to implement. And that's going on figures from the UAE, which is essentially a authoritarian state that doesn't have the planning permission issues and the logistic issues that Australia rightly has. It took 13 years for the UAE to get a functioning nuclear reactor going. It could only take Australia more. And given that there will be certain interests who will try and prevent it, we are probably looking at 17, 18, even 20 years for one to get up, and they're hoping to do 7. Okay, now they can run those together, but each area is going to have its own challenges. I know, too, that you go big or you go home, as they say, and I guess we could, for those of us who say we're too hard on the coalition, we could praise their bravery in going down this line. We might also suggest that there's a very fine line between foolishness and bravery. And what side of the line this falls on, I will leave to the reader. But it's a bad policy that I don't think even a soft press is going to save because, as we've noticed, the public will listen to the press when the public generally agrees with the press. But if the public doesn't agree with the press, then the press is actually of no good with you. And I don't think Peter Dutton has the persuasive skills of a Bob Hawke, say, or a John Howard, say, to be able to swing a hostile electorate around to something that's not very popular and not very good.
Oh, and that's why I think this is such a high-risk strategy by Peter Dutton and by the coalition. And also for such a big proposal, there's almost no details. And, you know, the coalition isn't very clear about what sort of nuclear reactors they're talking about. They're unclear about the size, whether they're talking about small nuclear reactors or something else. They haven't mentioned the price of all of this. They're confused about the time frame. And there's just so much rubbish within this proposal that even if there was massive public support for nuclear energy, and if that was the case, you just wouldn't want to build 7 nuclear power stations based on this proposal, and you wouldn't want to get the Liberal and National parties to build them either. And for this to all have political success, I think that it can only be successful if the public believes all of the outrageous lies and disinformation that the coalition keeps spreading. And that's about nuclear energy as well as renewable energy as well. So I do accept that some people will believe it, but not very many, because a lot of this is just so far-fetched, and a lot of it is so far-fetched that it's hard to understand why anyone would accept it. And so far there has been quite a bit of scepticism from the media, and this is the media that usually supports Peter Dutton and values every one of his words as gold-plated truth. So this is not a good sign for Peter Dutton or for the coalition. And there's quite a few other issues as well here, where there's constitutional issues where state premiers have to agree to all of these sites, and so far all of them have said no way. So it doesn't seem like much thought has gone into Peter Dutton's proposal, and he's been promising this for 2 years to release this proposal, and now that it's out there, there's not really that much to see.
There's obviously desperation in there. The theory is that, of course, he's doing this to drag out the dependence on coal. I think there's a lot of merit to that idea, because even Peter Dutton must realise that it's not really going to happen. And as you mentioned before, their record on being able to do infrastructure is appalling. Again, with a decent press or a consistently decent press, they'd be a laughingstock. They'd have lasted one term, if that, and would have been relegated to electoral limbo decades ago, probably 2007, maybe before. That Peter Dutton is the best that they've got speaks volumes. They removed nearly all of the moderates who were the electoral side of the Liberal Party, and now they're in this problem where they're promising nuclear reactors of, again, like you said, we don't know what type. For a long time they were on these ones that hadn't even been invented yet, had been spoken of theoretically in China, but don't actually exist. And things like Lithgow. Lithgow's a fine town, don't get me wrong, but it has had earthquakes. Earthquakes, as we saw in Japan, are very bad, and Chernobyl are very bad for nuclear reactors. And of course, the other point that should be made is that it'll start off being state-run and they'll sell it off as soon as possible. Maintenance budgets will get cut, staff budgets will get cut, and very quickly we'll have third-rate power stations and hundreds of square kilometres of unusable land because there's been a minor leak or a major leak with no way of being able to clean it up.
Oh, absolutely. And on that point of the coalition not being very good with infrastructure projects, and that's mainly because they never consider anything from a public interest perspective, but look at it through the prism of politics, how it will benefit them as a political party and how it will benefit their vested interests. And they're also ideologically opposed to state ownership of power assets. So as you suggested, you can imagine that they'd be selling off these nuclear power plants as soon as possible. And then you have that situation that happened in Fukushima where the owners over there, they shun their responsibility to maintain the power station properly, and then we had that major disaster that Japan is still dealing with, and Fukushima was over 14 years ago, and Japan is still dealing with it now. And it's also led to Japan closing down many of their nuclear power stations. Out of the 63 that they've built since 1961, they've only got 12 nuclear power stations in operation. It's a similar story in Germany, which decommissioned its last nuclear power plant in 2023, that's last year. And Germany has constructed 40 nuclear power plants since 1958, and the most recent plant was built in 1982, but now it's got none. And Germany is an economic powerhouse, not just of Europe, but of the entire world. And they've managed to move from nuclear energy to renewables. And their plan is to move to 100% renewable energy by 2035. And it does seem that most of the world is moving away from nuclear energy. And that's not to say that everyone is. France has got 62% of its energy supply coming from nuclear energy. Slovakia has got 59%, Ukraine 55%. But in the United States, it's only 18% of its overall energy source. And in the UK, it's 14% and falling. The world energy supply from nuclear energy is currently 10% and falling. The world energy supply from renewable energy is 30% and going up. So it's pretty obvious that nuclear is on the way out and renewables are on the way in. And it seems pretty obvious to everyone else in the world, but not to the coalition in Australia.
I know progressive people who think nuclear is not a bad idea, who say that the science and that the risk of meltdown is now negligible. We've learnt lessons from Chernobyl and Fukushima, and that it is very efficient. But I think at heart, its time has passed. It was a thing that had it been done in the 1980s and 1990s.
And there were quite a few proposals in the 1980s and the 1990s.
Yeah.
But they all found that it was very uneconomic to do nuclear energy in Australia.
Yeah. With all the sunlight we have and all the wind we have, Australia is a pretty wild and hot continent, relatively speaking. And I know many of our listeners will be sitting in cold temperatures with the heaters on and wrapped in blankets because we're in winter, saying, what do you mean? But you do know what I mean. The time, I think, has passed. And I'm not even sure there was a time, but if there was a time, it's passed. And we have to transition away from the reliance on coal. We'll never fully remove coal, but we can't afford for it to be the major energy source anymore. And oil, and we've got to do the transition. And government really has to step up and start helping people transition away from those types of things. Give everybody solar panels. Renationalise the power companies, those that aren't already nationalised. Sack the boards. Start charging the big miners their fair share of tax. If they don't like it and they go overseas, that's good riddance. Goodbye. See you later. Again, it really goes down to having a decent media, one that's not afraid to laugh at the patently ridiculous policies that Peter Dutton continually brings up, instead of treating them as if they're serious and if in fact they even want to do it. It's not a serious argument. It's not an intellectual argument. It's just clickbait and vote getting and culture war and virtue signalling and all the things that they accuse the other side of doing and done badly.
And we can see that this is an obvious political stitch-up against renewable energy. The leader of the National Party, David Littleproud, said that if the coalition wins the next election, they'll put a government spending and investment cap on nuclear projects such as offshore wind farms, because they're a bit of an eyesore apparently, even though they're about 20 kilometres offshore. And all of this is appealing to the cooker community of Australia, who claim that wind farms create all of these health problems, even though no scientific study in the world has been able to identify what those health problems are. And the proposal seems to be appealing to people who will believe the last thing that they're told about anything. And it's also appeasing the big proponents of uranium mining, and that's Gina Rinehart, who has been making a big push for uranium mining over the past few years. And it's also to appease people like Rupert Murdoch, who owns substantial uranium mining interests through the Cruden Investments family company. And we also have to remember that Peter Dutton flew to a News Corporation event last year that was sponsored by Gina Rinehart, and he charged the taxpayer $23,000 to go to that event, and he used the opportunity to criticise the government's response to the cost of living crisis. And there's no cost of living crisis for him if he can spend $23,000 of other people's money to go to a one-day Conservative love-in. And at that event, they probably talked a lot about nuclear energy while he was there. So that's where I think a lot of this is heading. It's got nothing to do with the public interest, and ultimately it's probably got nothing to do with electricity and nuclear energy. It's all about propping up Australia's wealthiest people and doing the bidding on their behalf.
The party that couldn't build a car park. Now, I'll admit I couldn't build a car park, but if I was in government, I'd have a list of people who could build them and I could get it started. They couldn't even pick up the phone to organise the contractors once they had the money. They could shovel the money to their contractors.
Well, it's the infrastructure version of couldn't hold a hose.
Not my job, mate. Except it is, the Liberal Party has to really look at itself in a harsh and honest way and think about why it exists, because at the moment it's not really giving much of a reason as to why it exists.
And this nuclear announcement, and I still don't think that anything will come of this or will come to fruition, but if it does, it's bad news for Australian consumers and for the public interest. But I do think that it's actually good news for Climate 200, which has just announced that it's targeting 9 extra seats at the next federal election. And Climate 200 is the political funding company founded by Simon Holmes à Court, and they supported the Teal independents in the 2019 and 2022 federal elections with great success. This time around, they'll be funding candidates in 4 seats in Queensland, 2 in New South Wales and 3 in Victoria. 4 of those seats have got margins between 8 and 11%, so those ones will be a little bit difficult to reach, but 5 of those seats are very marginal, of between 2 to 4%. So those seats are very winnable for this new round of Teal independents. So 5 of these seats are very vulnerable, and for any of those seats that are lost by the coalition, that's the Liberal or the National Party, that's extra seats that the coalition has to pick up from other parts of Australia. And the other factor that we have to look at is that since 1984, every election has seen the primary vote drop for the major political parties. It's never gone back up, it's always gone down. And at the last election, it got down to 69%. And I think that this nuclear announcement from the coalition will actually help this new batch of Teal independents. Now, it doesn't mean that they'll automatically win those seats. They still have to have good candidates in the first place and then put up a good campaign to win, but they are definitely in a much better position now. And this announcement, I think, will also probably help the Australian Greens in some of those seats that they're targeting in Melbourne and Sydney. So the coalition might feel that it's putting out the energy policy that will get some traction for them and get them into an election winning position, and it's probably banking on there being enough people opposed to wind farms in favour of nuclear power plants, but I just don't think there's enough people out there that will be putting them in this position.
Climate 200 has been remarkably successful at choosing the right candidates to support, and of course that folds back on itself in terms of they choose a candidate and the candidate finds themselves in a much stronger position. I've said before, the Climate 200 candidates as a whole have been very good additions to the parliament. I suspect that Cowper at 2%, Bradfield at 4%, Casey and Monash at 3% and Wannon at 4% will almost certainly go to Climate 200 candidates. And I think too, because there's a lot of misconception, that the candidates are selected by local people and then Climate 200 decides who they're going to support. Those people would still run for the seat. It's probably just a little bit more difficult, although I'd suspect they'd probably still win. But having comparable money or even more money than the big parties to run a campaign certainly helps. They are independent candidates, even if most of them broadly agree with each other. It's not a party. One day it may become a party, although I think in the short to medium term, at the very least, they'll just remain a loose coalition of similarly aligned members. I think the independents, particularly in what were once safe seats, I think that's really important, and I think that they will resist joining or forming a party for some time. Of course, if they do, that's a thing. But just knowing what I've seen about them, and we've had them on the show too, I think that they're fiercely independent, at least in the short to medium term. The other question is, where does the Liberal Party win? If they can't get those seats, where do they go to then? Then that remains a question that the strategists in the Liberal Party have to work out, because they're running out of seats that put them in a winning position.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, one of Australia's top 10 podcasts on Australian politics and news commentary. You can also find us at newpolitics.com.au, and you can also support us through Patreon and Substack.
I don't pretend to know the ways of the world. A means to an end seems the way. Who has the most of whatever is best? All the better. May the best man win. An eye for an eye is the blind man's rule. I wasn't born to follow. I'm nobody's fool. Any other man can soon.
Now, we have spent a lot of time rubbishing Peter Dutton, but Peter Dutton is now the preferred Prime Minister in the Resolve poll, and that's published in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, and it's not by much. He's preferred over the actual Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, by 35% to 34%, and a lot of our critics have said, oh, come on, it's just a one-off poll, polls can't be trusted, it's an outlier, it doesn't mean very much at all at this stage of the political cycle, and all of this is true. The preferred Prime Minister poll is pretty much a vanity exercise, and all of these polls don't mean very much this far out from an election, but they do mean something. They measure public perceptions on how the leaders and political parties are performing. But for me, the bigger issue is that Peter Dutton is not a very worthwhile political candidate, either as a Member of Parliament or as a leader of the Liberal Party. He was an incompetent minister while he was the Minister for Health. I think he was rated the worst health minister ever by doctors and medical professionals. And as the Minister for Immigration and Minister for Home Affairs, he was totally incompetent. And he also doesn't have strong intellectual capabilities. He's got the personality of a limpet on a rock or a lamppost. He's got the ideology of a tin pot right-wing dictator. Now, that's all fine if you're into leaders who are not intellectually gifted, or if you like limpets and lampposts, or if you like the ideologies of tin pot right-wing dictators. But Peter Dutton, as you can probably gauge by what we're saying, is not a very good political leader. And I realise that some of this might be a protest vote against the current performance of Anthony Albanese, but in any poll whatsoever, whether it's a news poll or a Resolve poll or a dinner party poll or a poll at the local pub, you know, that famous pub test that everyone keeps going on about, if you're up against someone who is as inept and as incompetent as Peter Dutton, and you're not way ahead as preferred Prime Minister, and then you're actually losing on that indicator, well, that suggests to me that you're in a bit of political trouble if you are the Prime Minister.
I think there's 5 or 6 factors, and I'll go from not the least important, but the ones that the people who are into the politics of things to the general public. The whistleblower laws, the whistleblowers going to jail, and while the people that they are reporting on get promoted. They promised that they would change that. They in fact haven't. Whether this is to do with another factor, which I'll be talking about in a second, is probably worth considering. Media reform. They promised that they would do something about the media. They did. They kowtowed to it. That's not what we were after. And the media has decided to repay this generosity by kicking into them more. AUKUS. We've been stuck with this terrible, terrible colonial deal that they refuse to get out of, and it is affecting their performance in other things like the Middle East. The Middle East is going to be a factor in certain safe labour seats because of the demographics. And if Australia is swinging independent, which it seems to be if we look at the last 4 or 5 elections, Labor will soon be running out of winnable seats. The tax cuts, etc. Again, but really the main thing is the perception of the economy. Prices are up, wages are down, unemployment is up, confidence is down. Now, unemployment's one of those things where it hasn't gone up that much, but it's all perception. And people are noticing that their weekly wage isn't going quite as far as it used to. I think that the Labor government is struggling against this type of stuff. Interest rates are on hold, and they're saying that they will go down, but not till December. There might be one more raise, and then they'll start cutting them. That's in the midst of a housing crisis, which is another thing that the government is getting the blame for, which is going to happen. You know, whoever's in charge gets the blame. We could point to Morrison-era policy. We can point to probably Abbott-era policy for a lot of this. But neither of those are in office anymore, thank goodness. So it's up to Labor to not just do stuff, but to be seen to be doing stuff, and to be doing stuff that works. And this is why desperate times call for desperate measures, and you've got to be pretty desperate to think Peter Dutton's better at anything.
Oh, of course, but this poll, as a lot of people have suggested, it could just be an outlier.
Sure.
But it's not a case where people look at this sort of poll and think, oh, Peter Dutton is more popular than Anthony Albanese. That's a little bit funny. And then they just move on to the next issue. But there are more people who are now starting to question the political skills of the Prime Minister and wondering whether this long-held strategy of cautious leadership, which started off early in Anthony Albanese's leadership back in 2019 and then continued into government, well, they're just wondering if this strategy is now stifling the government and whether there's enough flexibility to change this strategy or adapt to different circumstances. And of course, that was part of the general strategy of Anthony Albanese to set up a long-term government. But the problem is always going to be, which is what we've recommended or suggested before, well, what happens if you don't get there? If you lose office after the first term or go into minority government, you just have to use that power when you have it, because you never know how long it's going to last. And I think the main critique is that Anthony Albanese has tried to appease News Corporation. It hasn't done anything to reduce its influence. It avoids doing the things that might get some negative headlines, and it's almost like trying to be a lighter version of the Liberal Party rather than being a true Labor Party. And there's some of those issues that you referred to before, David. It hasn't called out the genocide being committed in Gaza. All of those issues with the Stage 3 tax cuts, which it left festering for almost 18 months. It's continued that dud deal of AUKUS. National Anti-Corruption Commission has failed in its first big test. And there was also that really bad campaign on the voice to Parliament. And Anthony Albanese allowed Dutton to not just set the agenda on that referendum, but it also dovetailed into Peter Dutton being able to set the agenda on all these other political issues as well. So the question is that being all of these things that are not true to the values of the Labor Party, trying to be something else, trying to be someone else, trying to be more like a Liberal Party and trying to appease News Corporation, well, it just hasn't been worth it. And I think that's what these opinion polls are suggesting at the moment.
It's like an abusive relationship. The government appeases News Corp and Fairfax and the ABC and Seven West Media. Those organisations respond by kicking into the government. Now, the press should kick into the government when necessary. I'm not saying that, the press should give the government a free ride or not be critical of the government. That is not the role of the press. But the way they're doing it is to, instead of saying, okay, here's the policy, here's why it's good. This is what they're trying to achieve, but it fails because of this, for example. And we will bring in a government spokesperson, hopefully the minister or someone who knows, to talk about it. If we have time, we will then bring in an opposition spokesperson to speak against it. But if they don't have good ideas speaking against it, we won't broadcast it, because that's bad television and that's bad press. And that's bad reading and it's bad radio and what have you. We might talk to some of the stakeholders, some of whom will think it's a good idea, some of whom may not think it's a good idea. And by stakeholders, I don't mean cafe owners because you're too lazy to walk further than 500 metres from the office and you were getting a coffee anyway. I mean representatives of organisations affected by the policy, whether for good or bad. And you build up the case. And you can be critical of the government. And of course, if there's corruption or malfeasance or inappropriateness, call that out too. But to just kick into the government, to give airtime to an unintelligent, unintellectual rabble isn't good press behaviour. Now, again, there's plenty for the government to be held accountable for. We've looked at some of it. But instead of being bullies and looking for the clicks, if the press started looking for the substance and looked at the substance on both sides. Again, if they really looked at the substance, the opposition would be laughed out of office. But they don't. They try and promote the opposition as a viable government when it's clearly not. And they try and promote the Labor Party or the government as completely incompetent when it's not completely incompetent.
And we are making it seem like it's all doom and gloom for the Labor government. It's not, but we've got to fill up the podcast episode somehow. But we are making it seem like it's doom and gloom for the Labor government, because the Labor government should be in a much better position politically against such an inept Liberal Party leader and a coalition in opposition that's even worse. And these are just opinion polls, but we do have to remember that Bill Shorten was way ahead in the opinion polls. He was preferred Prime Minister against Tony Abbott, never preferred against Malcolm Turnbull or Scott Morrison. And Bill Shorten went on to lose the 2019 federal election. Anthony Albanese was marginally preferred Prime Minister when he was up against Scott Morrison, not by much. And Albanese went on to win the 2022 federal election and was then streets ahead of Peter Dutton for over a year, but not anymore. But politics is a long game, and everything does change when an election is called. And the biggest test of an opposition leader is during the election campaign, and that's when all the political pressure will be lumped onto Peter Dutton. And generally, I don't think that he handles political pressure very well at all, and that's something that you cannot avoid as the leader, and especially during an election campaign. And with these nuclear adventures or misadventures, I think that this might be the start of the crumbling process for Peter Dutton as the leader of the Liberal Party.
To show the amount of pressure, if you look at pictures of Bob Hawke at the beginning of his prime ministership and at the end of prime ministership. He's aged more than those 10 years would suggest. John Howard aged more than his 12 years would suggest. Paul Keating aged more in his 5 years than that would suggest.
Scott Morrison seemed to be younger at the end of his period in office.
And yeah, if you do the job properly, it's a harrowing job with a lot of pressure, a lot of snap decisions to be made that have far-reaching consequences for everybody, and the wrong minor decision can affect thousands and thousands of lives and livelihoods. Scott Morrison never took the job seriously. Peter Dutton's reluctance to step up to pressure is something that will be part of his downfall, I think. I'm sure Anthony Albanese feels the pressure. I know that there's a lot of people out there, and maybe our listeners too, who think that there's a sense in which Anthony Albanese is a worse Prime Minister than Scott Morrison because nobody on the left at least, and segments of the right, expected anything from such a third-rate mediocrity as Morrison. But from Anthony Albanese, who was considered a more substantial figure, they've got a lot less and are hence disappointed. At the end of his tenure, Prime Minister, whenever that will be, we can then look at it and see how successful it was. Which isn't to say I won't criticise decisions he makes now, but there's still a fair bit to go in his Prime Ministership yet. Yeah, so Dutton can't handle the pressure. We know this. He's never been on a hard show. He's never faced down Laura Tingle since becoming Leader of the Opposition. He's been on Insiders, which is telling, and that may suggest that Insiders warrants the criticism it gets by many of its detractors. He goes on Sky News, where it's a whole lot of soft answers and soft questions. There's an open invitation to him, as there is to all members of Parliament, or most members of Parliament, to come on here. I doubt if we were to ask him, he'd come on here, because we'd ask probing questions. For all of John Howard's many faults, he loved getting into a hostile interview and pushing his case. He loved it. Sometimes he did well, sometimes he didn't do well. Paul Keating loved it. In fact, Paul Keating, I think, probably preferred hard interviews to soft interviews because he could smack the journalists down and it got his political fire going. Malcolm Turnbull thinks he likes it but doesn't cope well with it. Julia Gillard, I don't think, got a soft interview ever till after she was finished as Prime Minister. Kevin Rudd just took it all in his stride, or at least pretended to. But yeah, Peter Dutton needs to face some hard questions. And on the rare occasion he does, he folds. So I think this is an outlier. And again, it's a fairly pointless who's the preferred Prime Minister. I like Kang from The Simpsons, it makes no sense at all. But it'll be interesting to see how this poll tracks over other pollsters and over the next 12 months or so.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
We also had the visit of Premier Li Qiang to Australia during the week, and anything to do with China for the Australian media has to be shrouded with suspicion that they're going to take something away from us, that they're going to start up a war, or just some old-fashioned anti-China racism. Here's Danica DiGiorgio from Sky News.
The Chinese Premier Li tour of Australia came to an end today. It's a tour that can only be described as a complete and utter waste of time. There was really no point in this delegation coming, because all this trip has proven is how respect is a one-way stream. Beijing officials came here and showed complete contempt by bullying Sky News presenter Cheng Lei. And this is a disaster for Albanese. It really is a PR disaster. China has Labor where they want them, and that's over a barrel. And Albo's weakness to stand up to this regime has really been on full display this week. The Chinese came here, threw two pandas at us, they smiled, they clapped, and Albo was lapping it up. But behind the scenes, China proved they cannot be trusted.
And there was a big deal made out of an apparent blocking of journalist Cheng Li. She's the journalist who was imprisoned by China for 3 years and released without charge last year. She now works for Sky News, and of course Sky News made this the issue, not the actual visit.
Minister, while you were some of the documents were being signed in the committee room today, so Chinese embassy officials tried to block my colleague here, Cheng Lei, from the view of cameras. Is it acceptable to import that kind of behaviour into the heart of Australia's democracy here in Parliament House?
Well, I didn't see that. I saw Cheng Lei and we smiled at each other during the event. Look, I'm not aware of those issues. It's important that people be allowed to participate fully, and that's what should happen in this building or anywhere else in Australia.
There's no question that China detaining Cheng Li for 3 years without charge is a very, very serious issue. But the media here wasn't interested in that. They just wanted to sour the relationship with China and Australia, to embarrass the Prime Minister and the Labor government. Now, David, you and I, we watch quite a bit of news. That's our job. And this visit by Premier Li Qiang was reported internationally, and I saw it on BBC, on CNN, on NBC and on Al Jazeera, and that's broadcasting across a broad spectrum there, and it wasn't really reported favourably or unfavourably. It was just reported. It was just announced that China and Australia are trying to patch up their relationship after all of those problems that were created by the Turnbull and Morrison governments, and things are slowly getting back to normal despite some skirmishes and differences here and there. And looking at the international news, it seems like just a normal and adult relationship between two countries who realise the importance of that relationship to both countries, although furthering their own respective interests. But looking at the Australian media, it's almost like a portrayal of two countries that despise each other and are on the brink of war.
Last week I was very harsh towards Penny Wong's performance as Foreign Minister, and I should have been a bit clearer in that her dreadful failings are to do with the situation in Palestine. Over the other side of the world, she's actually performing quite well. If it wasn't for Palestine, she'd be one of Australia's better foreign ministers. She shows strength, intelligence, compassion, tact, and pushes Australia's interests in practical and constructive ways. I still condemn her policies towards the Middle East. If we take that out for a second, in terms of what she's done in the region here, the South Pacific and into Asia, she's actually done a really good job, which makes her work in the Middle East worse, because we know that she's capable of doing this stuff. China doesn't want to give up Australian trade. It's not huge, but it's a substantial enough amount that if it lost Australian trade, there'd be an impact on the Chinese economy. Not a big one, but enough of a one. Of course, Australia doesn't want to lose Chinese trade. If we lost that, there'd be a massive impact on the Australian economy, roughly equivalent to Britain losing the EU and being part of that bloc. I don't think the real figures have come out yet, or they've been snuck out, but it's been disastrous. It would be roughly equivalent in Australia. We rely a lot on Chinese trade, both for imports and for exports. Of course, it's hard to be racist in today's society, so you've got to encode it a bit. So you can look at China, the evil superpower. And of course, I have problems with the Chinese government. I do not approve of everything they do. I'm sure President Xi is now starting to reconsider all his life's choices. Now I've said that because he's clearly a regular listener of the podcast. But in the real world, you have to deal with people you don't particularly like. And you can be critical without losing any of the trade and without damaging the relationship too much, but still getting your point across.
Oh, that's right, and that's what mature countries do. But for me, this just continues that ridiculous anti-China propaganda within the Australian media. And most of this is either to leverage support for the conservative side of politics, which it tried to do when the Morrison government was in office. And they had all of those trade sanctions after Scott Morrison and Peter Dutton accused China of deliberately causing the coronavirus outbreak in 2020. And now the media is trying to leverage that relationship with China against the Labor government. And the Labor government has worked very hard to normalise the relationship with China, primarily through Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese, and it probably won't get very much credit for this. Well, I know it won't get any credit for this at all within the Australian media, but this is a big advantage to the Australian economy. But it doesn't matter how normalised the relationship with China becomes or how well behaved China is. Once again, it's the fearful Australia, the fear of the outsider, the fear of the yellow peril, and the media always loves to ramp this up. And it's not just News Corporation and Sky News, it's the Sydney Morning Herald, it's the Age, it's the ABC. They're always quick to demonise China and create havoc and a sense of panic within that relationship.
You can ask John Howard how well criticising Chinese people goes, Australian politics. He blundered on that twice, once in the mid-80s where he lost the leadership, once again in 2007 where he not only lost government but he lost his own seat of Bennelong. I think there's 1.4 million people of Chinese background in Australia. And the Chinese people have been in Australia since about the 1830s. So there are people of Chinese heritage whose family have been here longer than a lot of people of Anglo heritage and Celtic heritage. We should be well past having to dog whistle racist tropes of the Chinese government wanting to take us over and we're just a vassal state of China, and it's not like that, and it's never been like that. Labor has been pro-China since about 1965.
I think it even goes before that, because the Labor Party has traditionally been pro-China. Remembering that it was Gough Whitlam who first recognised China back in 1972. I think it was one of his first acts as Prime Minister. He actually first called for the recognition of China in his maiden speech to Parliament all the way back in 1954.
Probably from 1948 with the Glorious Revolution. You got the left starting to support. Before then, of course, the White Australia policy has a big impact on what nearly every party thought about people from China. Having said that, Labor's been a long supporter. Some Liberal and National Party people have been supporters of China, but the support has been muted so they can pull this type of dog whistling nonsense. The double standards exist. Australia should criticise China on its treatment of Tibetans and Uyghurs and Falun Gong, and yes, it should. But if China is to say, how do you treat your indigenous people? Oh, that's terribly wrong, and how dare they? And even though that's a valid criticism. Or, what about Islamophobia? What would you know? Again, I think there's an adult, and there's a fairly constructive relationship there. There's going to be differences. There's going to be philosophical and political differences. But our media doesn't like to report on sensible policy that has beneficial long-term effects. It would rather pump up a war that's never going to happen, or at least not in the near future.
But also, with that 1.4 million Australian Chinese, and that's Australians who were either born here or emigrated from China, but, whatever the case is, they're Australian citizens, that is a significant voting bloc. And I think all of this anti-China rhetoric from the media and from the coalition, well, it might be popular with supporters of Peter Dutton or with One Nation and right-wing extremists, but ultimately these attacks on China and the Chinese community, I think it's always going to be beneficial politically and electorally to the Labor Party. And every relationship internationally, it's always going to be difficult, and it's usually about trade issues, but there's always issues between Australia and New Zealand, Australia and India with the United States, the European Union and with Britain, and China is no different to all of that. But the point is to try and minimise those differences and find common ground.
I think, was it Harry S. Truman who said diplomacy is a way of telling another country to go to hell in such a way that not only do they go, they look forward to the trip. And that's pretty much what happens. And Australia clashes with New Zealand all the time, clashes with Britain fairly regularly, should clash with America more. But at no point has anyone said, we've got to send troops to New Zealand and show these Kiwis what for, because that's ridiculous. At the moment, it's a right-wing government in New Zealand, it's a left-wing government in Australia, and they will disagree fundamentally on things. But when it gets down to it, they'll get on with business, and the trade and the agreements will continue as usual, and they'll be renegotiated every few years, and there'll be bluster and talk, but the quiet work of diplomacy will get done. And that's the same with China. We need less sky blowhards telling us that this is a bad thing and more just reporting on what's happening here.
There was also a pay rise for federal politicians during the week, and it was an increase of 3.5%. And of course, there was no fanfare about this. It was done very, very, very quietly. And you can be guaranteed that there will never be any argument against this from either the Labor Party, Liberal Party, the Nationals, the Greens, One Nation. And this is the only area where there will be triple, quadruple bipartisanship over this, and hope that the issue just fades away. And David, we're not people that suggest politicians shouldn't get anything at all, or if they do anything wrong, they should be put into stocks into Martin Place so we can throw rotten fruit and vegetables at them. I think the stocks would be okay, but maybe not the fruit and vegetables.
Can you send me a list of names?
And most politicians do work hard. You know, most of them. Rolf Babbitt probably doesn't, but most of them actually do. And this will take the backbencher salary up to $227,000 and the Prime Minister's salary up to $608,000. And we keep being told by the media that we're going through a cost of living crisis and everyone is doing it tough. And it would be better for politicians to show some solidarity with the electorate, postpone this pay rise to another time, maybe 5 years away, and I'm sure that that would be a certain vote winner. It's what Jacinda Ardern did in New Zealand, so it can be done and it should be done here.
The Australian Prime Minister gets paid more than the President of the United States. Now, there's a couple of benchmarks we can look to compare to see if this is fair. Population of the United States is what? 380 million people. Population of Australia is 27 million people. So the US president has a lot more people that he or she has to worry about. Land areas are about the same, okay? They're both a federal system, okay? The Australian Prime Minister isn't expected to interfere in world affairs, which the American president is supposed to. So it's a little bit embarrassing that the Australian Prime Minister is paid so much. If we cut those salaries by 30%, and half of our politicians listening have just had a stroke or heart attack just considering this.
And they've switched off completely.
It's still, $160,000 a year? And what we forget in these things is that they also get extra perks, travelling allowances, rental allowances, things like that can push it up over $1 million.
Well, when you put it that way, maybe we should be running for Parliament as well.
If I wasn't such a scandal-ridden cad and bounder, even Parliament has standards. And again, it's not so much, 3.5%, it's in line with inflation, sure, but they're not on the average wage. They could afford a massive pay cut and still be on much more than most of Australia and still be able to afford it. In fact, what I'd do is I would start with the travelling and rent and home away from home allowance and stuff like that. I'd have it that you could only claim meals when it was definitely a business meal, and you could only claim the cost of the meal, and you did it by receipts. And if it was an official expensive meal, you did it at Parliament House with in-house caterers. I wouldn't have the whole housing allowance, which allows you to own a home in Canberra and rent another one and that type of stuff. I know no one's breaking the rules, but the rules need to be changed. And then maybe they can, the $227,000 for a backbencher might be allowable. Even if you cut it down to $180,000, that's still a pretty good amount of money. And I do know it's a 7-day-a-week job and it can be 24 hours. But it's also a fairly generous salary. And if you want to earn more, go into private enterprise and see how well you'll go then, claiming travelling allowances and home away from home and etc. I think they've got to look at the optics here. Those wages can absorb 3.5% inflation. Someone on $60,000 a year working just as hard can't. And it's the perception that's important rather than the reality of it. And they shouldn't have taken the cut. They should have postponed it, or at least maybe postponed it for cabinet and shadow cabinet, but nobody else. There were ways around this that could have easily been avoided.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.
I have to sell it